6 types of risky conduct that we could see happening. What could they be?
Man, you are taking a deep dive. In almost every case I've dealt with, particularly moral issues, sexual issues, abuse issues, in almost every case I've dealt with, 1 or 2 of these 6 behaviors are always in play, almost always in play. And let me tell you what those are real quickly. Number 1.
Well, Phil Cooke, you're back on the podcast, and I tell you what, it's such an honor to have you back on the show. You're a hero of mine. I really look up to you in regards to your role as a media producer, director, writer. That whole space is, just such an exciting space, and thrilled to be talking to you today.
Well, I had a fantastic time the last time, and so we work well together. You ask great questions, and so I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, well, we're here to talk about your brand new book, and Church on Trial has just been released. It covers a range of issues that hold weight about the church's position and responsibility in today's digital era. So in the book, you emphasize something. It's not if we have a crisis, but actually when we have a crisis. In today's digital culture and barrage of social media, the opportunities of crises are just more amplified. And so the key is to intervene early, and the quicker we respond, the more easy it's going to be to navigate those crises as they arise. Could you expand on that?
Absolutely. You know, we live in this digital social media world. Word travels fast. And so it's so easy to say something inappropriate or say something stupid or say something we'd like to pull back on social media that very often we get in trouble. There's so many more ways of getting in trouble than my parents' generation. And so, I've seen leaders be forced to step down because of something inappropriate they said on social media. So we just have to be much more aware than ever before of these things. And obviously, you know, when we talk about a crisis, let me just say, when I've been a media guy in the church for decades, and early on, I started getting calls from churches who, had a crisis, either from the outside or the inside. Maybe it was the pastor who ran off with a secretary, or a youth leader who had an inappropriate relationship with a minor, or it was an outside force. Maybe some kid broke their leg on the playground and the parents are suing, or it could be a cancel culture protest against the church or the ministry. And they were just blindsided. They had no idea what to do. So I've been involved helping just church after church after church and ministry, helping them kind of navigate these things, because in today's world, it's more difficult than ever. So that's why I wrote the book, Church on Trial: How to Protect Your Congregation, Your Mission, and Your Reputation During a Crisis. So crises of all kinds can happen, and this really is a book about how to navigate those situations when they do.
Absolutely. And one common theme that I've seen throughout my church life, because I've been in the church for 30 years in the church. And so across that year kind of range, there's been different expressions that we've been a part of and been exposed to. But often when we attempt to have such an honoring relationship towards our leaders, and that's something I'm a huge advocate for. I know that, Jesus talked about honor, that, I too am a man under authority, said the centurion. Like, he recognized Jesus was a man who honored authority and actually carried authority because he had ultimate honor for the authority of his heavenly Father. But he also recognized the power of authority in cultures and in traditions and churches. And often we can so build this honor towards our leaders, which is so important. But one thing that, as Christ followers, we're commanded to believe the best in people. But at what point, in your opinion, and do you unpack in the book, do you think our discernment is often compromised?
Absolutely. When I was a kid, every pastor I knew wore a coat and tie in the pulpit. Everybody, even as a kid, I wore a coat and tie going to church. And obviously from the 60s, the 70s, and 80s, things have gotten a lot more casual. And we're that way with our relationships as well. So today, particularly when new believers come into the church, they don't really understand or have a sense of honoring the pastor or what his role is or why I, should be respectful of that. And I think honor, respect, all those things are important in everyday life. However, I think in some pastors' good effort to try to teach honor and respect, I think they've kind of gone a little too far to where they've surrounded themselves with people that would never in a million years question, anything the pastor or ministry leader would do. And that's one of our problems, I think, today. I want to help churches create a culture, certainly in the leadership team, where if a pastor or other leader makes, a bad decision, a stupid decision, an inappropriate decision, people can respectfully say, wait a second, pastor, maybe we need to talk about this. Maybe we need to rethink this whole thing, because so many people get in trouble simply because they'll make a bad decision and there's nobody there who will call them out. We want to be so respectful and so honoring that we just are afraid to say something. And I think that's gone too far, like you say, the other way. So there's no question that there is discernment here. There's a middle ground where we want to be honoring, we want to be respectful, but at the same time, we see a red flag. We see something happening, a decision that's being made or something that leader is doing. We need to be able to pull him aside or her aside and say, wait a second, let's rethink this. Let's talk about this. And that's just as important, I think, as honor and respect.
And even just bouncing on that, you realize that it's not so much whether we confront a mistake or something, it's more how we confront it.
Totally. That doesn't give us a license to be a jerk. I'm never going to go up to a pastor or a leader and, say, hey, you moron. Now, here's the funny thing. My team, I'm not a pastor. I'm not a ministry leader. My team, I'm a producer. So my team feels perfectly free to call me out all the time. And, as annoying as that can be, I think it's fantastic. But very often there's a spiritual debt that we see among a leadership team. I was at one situation, I'll just share real quick. I was in one situation where I happened to be at a leadership meeting at a church, and the pastor started trying to guess what color underwear women on the team were wearing. He said, Susan, you look like a pink gal. I bet your underwear is pink right now. Or Deborah, you look like a black lingerie person. I bet your panties are black. I mean, it was insane. I jerked the executive pastor out in the hallway, and I said, what is going on? And he said, oh no, the pastor's just a joker. Everybody gets it. It's no big deal. And it turned out to be a big deal, because 2 months later, he resigned, having a long-term affair with a woman in the church. And so I think, that kind of, but I'll tell you this though, when I look back on that meeting, I realized that most of the people in that meeting owed that pastor a great spiritual debt. 4 or 5 had been saved through his ministry. A couple marriages had been put back together. One guy went through the alcohol and drug rehab program the church launched. And in that situation where there's that much respect and that spiritual debt, people are hesitant to call out something dumb or stupid or inappropriate. So I think we just have to create a culture where people are not so overwhelmed by their respect or honor that they still feel like they should call it out. Hope that makes sense.
Absolutely. That gratitude can lead to a fierce loyalty that can blindside our discernment. And before we know it, we're serving someone and enabling them. And when love really actually looks like saying, we need to talk about something that could be really damaging your life and other people's lives. But yeah, often we're so afraid of our reputation being damaged, or our momentum being hindered. And it's powerful with regards to
the other factor that, by the way, is that the members of the ministry team get a salary, they get their title, they get their respect, they have a great job. And so, you bring that into the mix as well, and they're even going to be less likely to call a leader out. So, that's why we see very often if a ministry leader is accused of something inappropriate sexually, then, some kind of abuse, the leaders will circle the wagons to protect him or her, only to find out many cases later, just, weeks or months later, that victim was absolutely right. And he was wrong and inappropriate. And so we just have to be that circling the wagons mentality. Honestly, we want to protect the leader if we believe he's innocent, but we need to have an open mind and investigate both sides of the story.
Got a question about this celebrity culture that can so quickly seep into the church. These days, it seems as though even in the world, celebrity culture it's the cheapness of it is wildly on display, so much so that people wonder, like years ago, they would have said, oh, I saw this actor or this singer or this artist in the street, and the starstruckness and the awe and the grandeur. But today it's kind of like, I don't give a rip who they are. This sense of celebrity culture is getting so melted away from culture. And I think there's an element to that happening that's either already happened in the church or is still taking place in the church. What's your perspectives on what do you see God doing in addressing celebrity culture in the church? Because the Bible says judgment starts in the house of the Lord. He wants to clean up his house so that the world will see a beautiful expression of his kingdom. What's your perspective on celebrity culture?
It's happening. I mean, it's happened out there, and there's no question about it. And I don't know, I live in Los Angeles, so celebrity sightings are pretty common out here, and we see big stars and actors and people every day shopping at the grocery store or driving their car down the street, whatever. My wife almost ran over Paul McCartney a few years ago. That would have been a tragic thing. But it's just, I do see it getting a little bit less in the culture, but still people are enamored with celebrities. And it's a shame that it comes into the church. There's no question that, baby boomers created mega churches. We're the generation of rock and roll concerts and events, and we brought the lights and the smoke and everything into these kind of situations. And so we're to blame to a certain degree. But at the same time, there are people you like to hear preach, you like to hear sing, that you like to hear on stage, and people tend to gravitate to people they really relate to. So, we just have to be very sensitive that that whole celebrity culture can be poison. It can be a terrible, terrible thing, particularly when it comes to seeing a crisis in a church. If we have a moral failure, sexual abuse, those kind of things, it can become really bad because people don't want to turn in or criticize somebody who we think is a celebrity. So we need to be careful. Plus, the celebrity culture isolates the leader. And in those cases, the leaders get into trouble because they start being they're almost infallible. And when they've created a culture, or a culture happens around them where they're almost, honored to the point of being worshiped, that's when things can go really badly wrong. So it's up to us as individual believers. It's not something that you could just, flip a switch on. We as believers have to be responsible, mature enough to not let leaders get into these situations where they could be viewed as a celebrity. It's an important thing.
Would you agree that celebrity culture is just the counterfeit of the true heavenly model of honor?
Yeah, I think it is. I think that's a good way to put it. I think honor is a positive thing done right, done in a biblical way. I think you're right. Done in an unbiblical way tends to tilt into celebrity culture, and that's obviously a negative. Yeah.
Now, how serious is the problem? How much of the church is being affected by these crises? Like, if you think about the amount of people that might be impacted in their faith walk with God when these crises happen, what's your perspective, or what's some studies or stats that you've got around how serious this is?
Well, here in the U.S., for instance, there are 300,000 churches. So even though we see a lot of headlines related to crises and moral failures and abuse situations in churches, it's not as common as most people think. I have a friend who went through an abuse situation, and he is absolutely convinced it happens at every church in America, but it's just simply not true. There are thousands and thousands and thousands of godly men and women leading amazing churches according to biblical standards and authority, and it's fantastic. So it's not as bad. Now, doing what I do for a living, where I'm called frequently to go in and help, I see it more than most people do. And I do think what you see in the headlines, sadly, is just the tip of the iceberg. And I will say this. Most people associate it, mega churches, large ministries or mega churches get the publicity. So when a problem happens there, they get all the publicity. But I can tell you that for every mega church or every large ministry, there's probably 5, 6, maybe 10 small churches where it happens as well. When I was writing the book, a church here in the American South, it was a relatively small church, and they had a church secretary that over about a 6 or 8 year period, she'd embezzled $400,000 from the church. She paid for her college tuition. She paid for a couple of cars. She paid for part of her house. It was just amazing. And when she was caught, there were just no safeguards. And she was, everyone said, oh, she's the most trusted person in the church. That's why they put her in charge of the bank account. And when they found out, when it was exposed, she's going to go to jail and she's required to pay it back. But there's no way. I mean, that money's spent. She's never going to pay it back. And so the church has to close as a result. And that's the great tragedy to me. I don't want to see a church or a ministry be forced to shut down because one or two people made an extremely stupid decision. I just think that's so wrong. And so my goal, just for the record, my goal in going into these situations is not to protect the perpetrator. If a pastor or a leader had an affair with someone, they were sexually abusing someone, hey, he goes to the bottom of my list. I'm concerned about the victim first, and then the church. How do we keep the church moving forward? So that's what we need to do. And most pastors and leaders just aren't trained in that area, and they're blindsided. They have no idea what to do. And that's why it creates so many problems down the road.
Now, some of the perspectives that can form is we have clean hands. We've had a good running record. We've got a good track record with people, with fruitfulness in our ministry. And so sometimes there can be a belief that this couldn't happen to us. And I've been in ministry leadership positions where we actually believed in this where we're pretty safeguarded. We're very close to one another. We're living in each other's pockets almost. Nothing could go wrong because we're being so transparent. And what's your perspective on how easy is it for tragedy or crisis to strike?
Well, I don't always look at the dark side, but I can tell you that we never know what goes on in people's hearts. We just can't look into people's hearts like God can. And you just never know what people are struggling with, what their past has been, and what may pop up at any given moment. Plus, as I say, pornography, insanely easy to access now through our phones, through our mobile devices, our social media platforms. It's just incredibly easy to access. And it's really hard to describe the number of situations of ministry staff members who have been caught downloading pornography on their computer at their church office. So number one, if you're a church leader or a ministry leader and you don't have porn filters on your computers, that's a huge mistake. I just think that, in the early days of pornography filters, they were awkward. They kept you from going to legitimate sites. They didn't work very well. But today, they're highly refined, and you can get really great filters that keep people from wandering. And the truth is, you can do a simple search for something now and come up with some porn options. So, it's not something that's actually, you don't even have to actively be looking for it to pop up on your phone or pop up on your computer. So you just can't afford to be too careful in that respect at all. So like I say, you just never know what's going on in people's hearts. And so I'm always, one of the things I think is worth talking about is red flags, because, we're Christians. We want to think the best of people. And when we do see a red flag or a cause of concern, we want to take the high road. It's understandable. We want to believe that, Brother John over here or Sister Susan, I know that's kind of weird, but she's okay. She'll be fine. She'll work through it. Well, very often red flags are really our first warning sign. And I'm not a big advocate of false accusations, because they can destroy a life just as fast, and they can destroy a church or ministry as well. But being aware of red flags is really important. It's funny that when I've helped a church get through a crisis, when we get to the other side, I often will sit the leadership team down and say, okay, knowing what you know now, knowing what you've been through, looking back over the last year or two, do you remember any red flags that you saw that you didn't pay attention to? And in almost every case, they say, oh, absolutely. Now I know why she did this or why he was doing this. So I think very often we can eliminate so much of the problem if we would just be more sensitive to red flags. And like I say, they don't have to be publicly called out, or they don't have to be disrespected, but maybe it's time to sit down and have a little chat with our friend. Maybe if you see a staff member with a problem, maybe you go to a senior staff member and say, I've noticed this about Bob. Maybe it would be good for you to have a conversation with him about that. Those kind of things, those little preemptive moments can really save a major tragedy happening in the future.
Can you give us 3 or 4 red flags that might be common when you're looking at a leader who is either in a pulpit, or a leader who's a coordinating leader, or someone who might be a home group leader? What are some maybe 3 or 4 flags that would be common for us to identify in the process?
Well, one of them, I could give you examples of cases that I've dealt with. A case where maybe a youth leader is spending just a little too much time with a particular girl in the youth group. Or it could be a woman spending particular time with a young guy. And that youth group member may be minor, maybe in high school, but it's just a red flag when suddenly they're calling that young person at home. They're meeting separately with that young person or the spending extra time, that's certainly a red flag. Another one is I'm always concerned about leaders who travel. I know pastors and ministry leaders that travel the world doing amazing things and never take their spouse. Now, I know that sometimes your spouse doesn't want to travel. I know that as you get older, the spouse may want to spend time with the grandkids. But with my wife, Kathleen, if I'm going somewhere, I was just this weekend, I went to speak at a conference in Oklahoma. And if it's I was in one day and out the next, that kind of situation, no problem. But if it's much longer than that, I'm going to take my wife, Kathleen. I just want to be careful and guard myself against those kind of situations. So I'm always concerned when leaders travel too much without their spouse. I think it's a problem. Another red flag is when you get, and trust me, every leader listening to this will probably understand what I'm talking about. Sooner or later, you won't go long in ministry before you get an unwanted message from an admirer out there. I remember I spoke at a big media conference in South Africa a number of years ago. And a month after the conference, I got an email from a woman who was very beautiful. And I knew because she sent me pictures. And she really talked about how brilliant I was and how she'd like to spend some time with me and really be mentored by me. And it was just a little icky. So I have a system in my office where I have at least 3 people that can see my email, at least 3 that have access to my calendar. So I went to my female assistant and I had her respond to this woman. And the minute that woman realized my female assistant is seeing all my emails, we never heard from her again. So you just have to be very sensitive and careful. I always tell pastors and leaders, if you get an unwanted message from an admirer, so to speak, don't respond at all. Just don't respond. If it's questionable, give it to your secretary or your assistant, have them respond. That way, if you just misunderstood and it's perfectly innocent, it'll all work out. But if it's not, you'll know that pretty quickly as well. So those kind of things in this digital age we live in can be very, very important.
Yeah, absolutely. Especially that whole transparency of emails. Like that's a huge one that I don't think would be hugely common across the board. So I love that you mentioned that. I think there'll be people who listen and go, actually, I need to implement that kind of strategy.
Absolutely. You know, when I've got multiple people seeing my emails, multiple people seeing my calendar, it would be pretty hard for me to arrange a rendezvous or some secret meeting. So I think that's fantastic.
Yeah, such a good safeguard. Church on Trial by Phil Cooke is a timely piece of prophetic and practical literature for leaders who both lead inside the conventional church and for the body of Christ at large, whether in vocational or parachurch ministry or church in the marketplace. I'm talking to Phil Cooke today about his newest book, Church on Trial. It's been a great discussion so far, but we're about to dive a bit deeper. Crisis communication, Phil, is not about defending other people's mistakes or helping them escape consequences. What is the purpose of crisis communication?
Absolutely. It's for getting the right story out to the right people. It's interesting that people often, I was one of them who thought early in my career that, public relations or crisis communication was about covering up for people or, covering up somebody's mistakes. But the truth is, it's about getting the right story out there. I mean, in this social media, digital world we live in, man, stories can fly, rumors can fly. And it's very important that the right story be told to the right people. And also the actions we take. Very often, one of the mistakes that historically that church leaders have made is when it is a case of abuse, whether it's a minor or an adult, we try so hard to, help the church move on, but we completely neglect the victim. And so I'm a big advocate of the first thing I want to do is how do we get help for the victim? Does that man or woman need therapy, counseling? What is it? Let's take care of that and make sure they're ministered to and taken care of. Then let's really focus on righting the church and getting the ship back in order. It's really about telling the right story to the right people, particularly if the media gets involved. Because as you know, the media doesn't always tell the right story. And those kind of stories can be changed quite easily in the editing room. And so I just want to be sure. I often tell churches, number one, make your first call to an attorney, because there's a lot of legal issues here. And if it's a minor, we have to report it to authorities now. But the second call might be to a communications expert, somebody that knows how to help you get that story out. How do we tell the congregation? When do we tell the congregation? Do we tell our leadership team first? When do we go public? All those are important issues that really help people understand what's going on. I go back very often after the crucifixion of Christ, when Judas hanged himself. Peter went back to the disciples and explained what happened. He didn't go into gory detail about what happened to Judas, but he was very clear and very direct in explaining how Judas committed suicide. So that's the thing I want to do. I want to be very clear and direct. No reason to dwell on it or go into the bloody detail, but we want to tell the story directly. And you can never cover anything up. One thing I would say is we have to always be honest according to what you know at that moment. You may not know the full story, but be honest with what you know. The minute you try to cover something up for whatever reason, it may be what sounds like a good reason, protecting someone or protecting a church or ministry, it will always come back to bite you later.
Now, who should be the key crisis communicator? Let's say it's not the senior pastor that's been the cause of the crisis. Should it be the senior pastor who's the crisis communicator? Should they have someone elected to assist the pastor with communicating crises? Obviously they should if they're the person who's the cause of the crisis. But what's your thoughts about how can pastors strengthen a team around them that's going to enable an easy flow effect of that crisis communication?
Well, if it's a big crisis, having a spokesman can be very, very important, or a spokeswoman can be very, very important. And very often people, and there's a couple ways to go. There is a time when the pastor or the ministry leader can be the spokesperson. In fact, people love to know that they're talking to the bottom line. They want to know they're talking to the top man or woman at the mission. So there is a time when pastors or ministry leaders make good spokespeople, and they're also usually very comfortable on stage. They're comfortable in front of people. They're good at spontaneous, thinking on their feet. So they can be a very, very good choice. However, there are times when maybe the pastor is caught up in trying to manage the crisis, or the ministry leader is, and we need to have someone else. And my recommendation is it can be a staff member. It might be an outsider. It might be a public relations person, somebody you've engaged to help get through this. But it needs to be somebody who is very confident in front of the media, who can think on their feet, because they're going to be facing a lot of questions, and they need to know an enormous amount about the ministry. If they don't know the history of the ministry, the history of the church, they're going to look, very, very foolish. So I think that if you can find that person, great. And I also advocate that for your senior leaders, maybe a handful of top leaders, it never hurts to have a little media training with them. Practice sometimes when they're going to be, practice with them on camera. Practice with them taking difficult questions. That can help train them so you can learn who on your team could be a potential candidate for doing it. Now, in most cases, most crisis situations, there's really no need for an official spokesperson. But if something gets really, really serious, I think that can become a really important asset to have.
So a mock-up press conference kind of dynamic as a training session for crisis communication. What would you say to the pastor that says, we don't need that training?
Yeah, well, pastors are an interesting breed. I love pastors. I work with hundreds of them. And, Bible school and seminary does not teach about communication. It doesn't teach about media, and it certainly doesn't deal with dealing with a crisis. So I just think that, pastors need to understand these things, and they are not simple. They're not something you can just, I think one of the reasons I wrote the book is at least you'll be able to get up to speed, underline, sections, dog-ear pages, so you have a reference, because one of the key things in a crisis is acting quickly. We want to act quickly. The first 24 to 48 hours after a crisis goes public is just really, really, really critical what you do and the actions you take. So I even recommend people get a copy of the book for your senior leaders, for your elders, for your board members, because the more people you have around the table that really are up to speed, the better. But when you can, I think it's a fantastic thing. I can tell you nightmare after nightmare of pastors who were overconfident about a media interview with secular media. They went in and they just got completely creamed, and they got eviscerated on camera. And I know one here in the U.S. One major national television network tried to, told a major ministry leader that they thought he was going to be the next Billy Graham, and they'd love to sit down and do an interview with him. So he, his ego got attention, and he went and did the interview. But once he sat down, they started showing all kind of examples of inappropriate conduct in his ministry, and literally the ministry pretty much collapsed overnight. So we cannot ever be too overconfident. I think it's a mistake to be overconfident when it comes to dealing with the secular media.
Mm. In your book, you talk about there's two crises. There's the internal crisis and there's the external crisis.
Yeah.
Could you expand on that a little bit on how that applies across the board with regards to crisis management?
Yeah, in my experience, there's two major crises. One is the outside. Maybe it's what I deal with a lot is maybe it's a disgruntled ex-church member or a disgruntled ex-staff member who decides to open a Facebook page just for the purpose of criticizing the church. I know one very, very successful church, a great church here in the Midwest, here in the West, who has an ex-church member, we think, that started a blog, and every week all he does is blog about what a disaster that church is and how bad that church is. And it's gotten popular enough that local media will check it from time to time to see if they need to report on something. So that's an external crisis. People on the outside, like I said earlier, kid breaking his leg on the playground and the parents suing the church. Those kind of things come from the outside. The internal crisis, and I have to say, most of the internal crises I see are pretty much self-inflicted. They're just bad decisions someone makes. Like I said, inappropriate relationship with a minor. That's sex abuse. That's just child abuse and sex abuse. And that needs to be dealt with legally as well as appropriately. So I think that's the case. Moral failures of all kinds. We see embezzlement, lots of issues like that. So that's from inside. And very often the inner, we can't control the outside as much because we never know what people are going to do, if they're going to sue us, if they're going to threaten us, whatever. But the inside, if we could try to get a handle on that, I think that's what really undermines the church. And when people look at that and say, well, if those leaders would do that, then why do I need to go to church? I don't want to. In fact, one of the statistics in the book is that 27% of church members that leave the church for good do it because of a crisis that happened at their church or how poorly the church handled the crisis. Now, keep in mind, these aren't people that left the church to go to another church. They turned their back on God altogether. So I think if we could clean this up, if we could get our act together here, we could save more than a quarter of church members who are leaving the church for good. And that would make such a powerful, powerful impact.
This kind of resource, Phil Cooke's book, Church in Crisis, is the kind of resource that God's giving people so that we don't have a continual run through generations, because God is a God of generations. And we have seen through the generations faithful leaders in the church, body of Christ, revival, Reformation leaders who have done so, their mission before God with integrity, with passion, with humility, and with transparency. But there have been many also stories where integrity has collapsed or compromise has taken place. And this kind of resource is the kind of thing that could shift the rudder of the body of Christ so that generations to come, we don't have to keep repeating history. And so I really appreciate you sharing about all this, Phil, because as you're talking, I'm just thinking about scenario after scenario that I have either heard about through the media or through friendships or ministry circles, or that have happened directly in my zone of proximity in church life. And this is something that could totally shift the pattern. And if leaders are willing enough to say, we need this kind of thing, and we're going to implement this kind of thing to save our church and our children and their children's children, a whole lot of pain that's unnecessary. So springing from that, did you want to say anything on top of that?
No, it's a hard topic, and I admire you for being able to being willing to bring it up, because it is a difficult subject and nobody wants to think it would happen to us, but I can just tell you time after time after time it does, and you just never know. So understanding these issues and how important they are, I think is critical. So, kudos to you. Well done. I think it's difficult, but you've done a great job.
Thanks, Phil. And I think one of the things that people really need to hear as well is where you're talking about this, we need to see that coupled with church leaders that are sharing vulnerably their journey and how did they recover from their mistakes. Because there's no such thing as no way back. This thing of repentance is so redemptive. Doesn't mean the way back to the pulpit if you've blown it. No, not necessarily, but doesn't blow up the whole dynamic of being in the kingdom and being a son and a daughter of God. And so it's really important to have these conversations where people are saying, well, for example, if I'm going to be upfront and vulnerable, my journey is I got wounded in church abuse, and my journey has been to forgive. And now I can say God has done so much work in my heart. And as a result of that abuse, I would actually, and when I'm talking about abuse, I'm just talking about misuse of people's time, expecting people to voluntarily give their lives to serving my ministry and things like that, and shaming them if they weren't giving enough. And that kind of stuff is very common. And I replicated that to people that I was leading. And so I've had to repent for that and receive their forgiveness. And in same turn, I've had to forgive those who did that to me as well. And I'm incredibly grateful that God restores. He makes all things new if we give him the space to do that. And so it's important to hear those stories coming through as well from people who have made mistakes and are thinking, well, I've been the cause of a crisis. All I'm feeling is shame around this conversation. What is the way home? How do I get back to living on the other side of a crisis? Is there redemption for me? And obviously Jesus made it explicitly clear that there is a way back for anyone as long as they come. So
That's
at
good.
what point, Phil, does a one-time crisis become a culture of abuse?
Well, it's funny you say that, you ask that, because there have been situations I've gone into where it had been going on so long, or it had involved so many people that the entire church had become tainted, and you see that particularly in cases where there are people trying to protect a leader, not because they assume he's innocent, because they know he's guilty, and they're still trying to protect him or her. And so I think that there are situations where an abusive situation has been going on, and the inner circle of leaders knew it and protected. We've seen that a lot in the Southern Baptist denomination here in the U.S. There's been some cases where someone was protected for literally decades in some cases. And we've seen it in other situations as well. So in those cases, it might be better for a church or a ministry just to shut down and start over. Ravi Zacharias probably is the best example here in the U.S. recently, where that it was just so horrible. The details, the more they came out, the more people realized we don't want to continue to fund that organization, even though the staff, there was great people that worked at Ravi Zacharias Ministries. I knew many of them. And but it was so dark there that it was just time to shut that down, which they did. And it's a tragedy, but there is no question that some things, there's just so much negative baggage attached to whatever that crisis situation was, that it's better. Now, in some cases, it might be better to change a ministry name, or a church's name. Sometimes the negative baggage becomes so attached to the name that maybe if you want to continue, it would be worth it to consider changing the name and trying to reemerge as a new ministry with a new team. So there's a couple different options there, but just to know, there is situations that I've seen where it's so bad, so negative, so dark, that my recommendation is let's just shut this down and restart it another way, or just shut it down and walk away.
That's good. Terminology in your book of leaders are encouraged to have a glass door. You may have referred to this before about sharing your email inbox with a personal assistant and other members of your team. What other elements are you talking about when you're encouraging leaders to have a culture of a glass door?
Well, being transparent is not just with email or the way you live or your behavior. I move it into the physical world as well. I met a pastor many, many years ago in Chicago, who had a real burden for his staff to have integrity, really wanted to teach his staff integrity and wanted to build a culture of integrity. So when he remodeled the office building for their church, he put in a glass window and or glass door in every room in the building. And when we bought a building here in Los Angeles for our Cooke Media Group team, I did the same thing. We remodeled that, and I put in a glass door, and we did it in a very cool way. We used chicken wire, windows that we got from an old warehouse. It was very cool. But we put a glass door and window in every single office. And the theory is you just want to eliminate any possibility of what we call hanky-panky, people doing inappropriate things. And some people will say, well, Phil, if they're going to have a relationship, they'll do it somewhere else. Actually, that's not the case. In my experience, the vast, vast, vast majority of inappropriate relationships started at the office. And so if you could eliminate it happening there, I think you could eliminate it in most places, because most people aren't going to go to the trouble of trying to find secret rendezvous. Think about it. You're in a church or a ministry, you're working with your team. It's an intimate group. You start working maybe with one person in particular, a lot of hours, that person of the opposite sex. And before long, one thing leads to another. So I just want it all out in the open. With my team, I want it out in the open. Everybody can see what goes on. You can have privacy behind glass. Nobody can hear our phone calls, or nobody can hear our conversations, but they can see what's going on. And I just think that kind of a transparent culture really makes a big, big difference for a church or ministry. And plus, it says to the general public how much you value integrity, which I think is a very positive statement to make.
And then we got nothing to hide.
Yeah.
That there's no corners in our room that have anything that could be stuffed under the carpet or anything like that. Yeah, that's really good, Phil. I'd like to envision that for my own office. Glass doors.
Well, let me tell you, for church leaders listening, pastors, ministry leaders, the cheapest thing you could do is replace your office doors with glass doors. I mean, you can go down to local hardware and get them. It's cheap. And trust me, what little cost there is could save you millions of dollars in lawsuits later. It could save your embarrassment, humiliation. It could save your reputation. So you just never know. So I just would caution people, go out today. As soon as they finish listening to this podcast, go out and consider replacing your office doors with glass doors. It's so easy, and it can be so significant.
As the dust of human frailty in the church settles, we're speaking from the world's perspective now, as in the general public. You mentioned the general public. What is it, do you think, the general public need to see from Christian leaders today?
Well, I think they need to see us living the way the Bible calls us to live. I think, so many Christians, I wrote a book a number of years ago called The Way Back, How Christians Blew Our Credibility and How We Get It Back. And in that, I did a deep dive into research about how Christians live their lives. And I'm talking about people that show up in church that will say they've had a born again experience. These weren't people that just say they're Christian. These were people that are trying to be Christians. And what I discovered was just pathetic. I mean, if they show up 3 out of 8 Sundays, the pastor's thrilled. He considers you a regular. That's how low the bar is on church attendance anymore. When it comes to giving, we found out that less than 10% of church-going Christians will give 10% of their income to the work of the Lord. We found out with prayer, 63% of church-going Christians believe prayer is effective. I thought, okay, that's a majority, until I realized it also means 67%, more than a third of Christians in the pew today don't believe prayer is effective. And then when it comes to reading the Bible, it's horrifying. I mean, we found out only 19% of church-going Christians read the Bible every day. And we found out that 40%, almost half the Christians in church pews today, read the Bible once a month, rarely or never. So the bottom line is the world looks at that and thinks those guys are just hypocrites. They don't live the life they're talking about. I mean, I often say we're happy to criticize, the LGBTQ community. We're happy to criticize Hollywood, but we're not living the life God called us to live. In many ways, we become the fat guy in the gym that lectures everybody else about health. And so as a result, people think, why do I want to be one of those guys? And I think it's really damaging when we don't live the life God has called us to live. That would be the thing I would really call people to, because if they could see that our lives are different, we have great marriages, we have great families, we live in joy, I think the world would look at that and think, I'm not so sure about this Jesus thing, but I want that marriage. I want a family like that. I want to live in that attitude. That could be the most powerful witness we could possibly do.
Yeah, and on that, it's so often that they might be hooked in or drawn in by the charisma of a really influential leader and see them present well and like, wow, that's really inspiring. But then see them at the grocery store yelling at their kids or being dishonoring to their wife.
Yeah. I found out, during that research, I found out here in the U.S., I don't know about Australia, but here in the U.S., 76% of Americans don't know their neighbor's name. So maybe we just start going over and starting a conversation. We don't have to witness to them or share the gospel right away. Let's just learn who they are. Someone once told me, you want to be a missionary? Great. Go next door. I think that, if we just started there, it would make a big difference.
So good. Church on Trial by Phil Cooke is a timely piece of prophetic and practical literature for leaders who both lead inside the conventional church and the body of Christ, whether in vocational or parachurch ministry or the church in the marketplace. How can a publicist support a sustainable and healthy culture in a ministry film?
You know what? There's a role out there with PR people called the publicist, also a PR person, which means public relations. And their job generally is to tell your story out there. You're launching a new ministry outreach. You're launching a new private school at your church. There's plenty of opportunities to get that story out there. I think one of the great failures of churches today is they don't spend enough time trying to tell the good story about all the work they're doing out there. So yes, I think that either maybe you just have someone on your staff who's calling the local newspaper, calling the local media outlets, or calling digital platforms to try to get your story out there. But a publicist or a PR person is somebody who really understands who to contact to try to get your story out there in a big way. I just think that there's so many opportunities for the incredible work that most churches are doing to get their story told to more and more people.
Fantastic. 6 types of risky conduct that we could see happening. What could they be?
Man, you are taking a deep dive. You know what? It's interesting. That's a great question because, and I have to explain this properly, because in almost every case I've dealt with, particularly moral issues, sexual issues, abuse issues, in almost every case I've dealt with, 1 or 2 of these 6 behaviors are always in play, almost always in play. And let me tell you what those are real quickly. Number 1, abusing alcohol and or sleeping pills. A lot of people think pastors don't and ministry leaders don't drink, but a lot of them do. Particularly in Australia, it's much more popular than here in the U.S. I don't think the Bible prohibits alcohol, but it does prohibit drunkenness. And the problem is there's a fine line between, a few drinks and getting tipsy or getting drunk. And I know pastors who would have too many drinks, then go online and start ranting about stuff. So you can get pretty crazy pretty quickly. Sleeping pills are the same. A lot of pastors have had trouble with sleeping pills, going into, walking into really bad situations. So number 1, I see a lot of that out there. Number 2, crude or sexualized joking with staff members. The story I told earlier about the pastor who was trying to guess the color of his female staff member's underwear is a great example. It's just, you get a team around you that you've worked with for years. You have this sense of intimacy and friendship, and occasionally you're just going to cross the boundaries, and you have to be very, very careful about that, because you never know who might be offended, who might sue the church. It's just not good to be inappropriate at any time like that with your staff. So I do see a lot of cases where something came out of a culture where it was normal to be, tell crude jokes or sexual content and jokes. And that's not a good thing. The third thing is spending too much time away from your spouse. I mentioned this earlier. I see a lot of problems that happen when ministry leaders travel alone without their husband or their wife. And I think that's something that needs to be addressed, and people need to understand. I would even say with your church staff, when they travel on business for the church, have the budget, try to have the budget to have their wife or husband go with them. That would really help build you up as a marriage-friendly church. And number 4 is a fascination with pornography. I see that a lot. I mentioned earlier the number of pastors and ministry leaders who are downloading this stuff in their office computer at the church. It's just staggering. And it's just so easy to get hooked on this because you can get it through your phone, get it through social media platforms. So I do see that a lot. And the final 2 things, number 5, is what I call really stupid decisions. Kind of mentioned that, but really stupid decision. I can't tell you how often I've seen something just in retrospect was just so dumb. One pastor, for instance, a major pastor here in the U.S., thought he could be more productive if he had his female assistant, move into his house with he and his wife. Well, obviously the wife is going to be gone to certain events and things, and one thing is going to lead to another, and it didn't go well at all. And looking back, you think, what a dumb idea. That's just inappropriate. And somebody should have called their hand on it. So I can go on and on and on about just really stupid decisions that pastors and leaders have made. And the final thing is a culture where no one can question the boss's decision. We talked about a culture of honesty and respect, which is great, but you don't want that to eventually lead into a culture where the boss thinks it's my way or the highway. And if people feel compelled to agree with the boss, even when something the boss is doing is uncomfortable for them or inappropriate, that can lead to a problem. So just to understand those 6 things, if we could get a handle on those, literally at least one or two have been in play in almost every situation I've ever dealt with. And that's a lot of situations. So I think if we could get a handle on those, it would make a dramatic dent in the number of mistakes, failures, abuse situations we find at the church. Obviously things are going to happen from all sides, but that would make a great start if we could fix those things.
It's removing those entry doors, basically, those doors where opportunity is created for compromise, corruption. It seems many of the church leadership scandals that we hear about lead to their church ultimately collapsing. You discuss or explain in your book that a truly strong culture wouldn't allow this level of damage. Can you walk us through that?
Well, there are situations where somebody's going to do something inappropriate, something stupid, but you're not going to get into it. If you have a strong culture, if you have a really positive culture in your church or your ministry, you're never going to get to the point where multiple people know about it. You're never going to get to a point where people try to cover up sin. You're never going to get to a point where it becomes visible. And so I think that if we're looking for red flags, if we're really sensitive to the people on our team and the people around us, we're looking at their behavior. And again, you're not there to be a behavior cop. You're not going to make false accusations, but you just want to be sensitive to people. People are struggling. We want to be sensitive. If we have a healthy culture that supports people, that's transparent, then I think it's really cuts the chances down of something being significant. I think of even having a problem at all, much less having the size of a problem that would cause a church or a ministry to completely collapse.
Yeah, that's good. It's really about the strength of the team that's created. The lead pastor or senior pastor has given them permission, voice, to say, you guys need to be not just on my team to follow where I'm going, but also have your eyes and ears open. One of the things I love about in the beginning that God said, I'll give Adam a helper, that word helper is the same word used for the Holy Spirit as a helper the helper will come. But that, so I think it's the Greek word discusses that the helping role the woman was given was to identify and expose the enemy behind Adam's back. And so having team members that know it's their job to actually keep an eye out for the enemy and expose it. And I know I have conversations like that with my wife. I say, Mia, I need you to pray for me because I know I'm in a vulnerable space at the moment. And that could mean opportunities could arise where the enemy might try and access me in a way that is not okay.
That's true. It's funny. And when we launched our company in 1991, I know we're going long here. I don't want to rant, but when we launched our company in 1991, my first assistant, Jeanette was her name, she would not even drive me to the airport. She would not get in the car with me unless there was somebody else in the car with me. She just wouldn't do it. And the airport is literally 5 minutes from my house here in LA. I live like 5 minutes from the airport, and she would not even run me to the airport or run me for some other thing like that without someone else in the car. And it was annoying sometimes, but looking back in retrospect, I realized that was the kind of transparent, supportive team member we need. We need those kind of people. They'll say, "I'm sorry, I'm not going to do it." We need to draw those lines, and that's what makes a big difference for people. So, yeah, you're right. Having a team is great.
Simple strategies like that so easily looked over or seen as, oh, we don't need that. We're above board. And no, I love how simple but powerful these strategies are that are coming out, Phil. It's fantastic. I want to give something to the creatives because This is Art Vance and this podcast is about God's heart for the arts. How can artists and creatives, in the midst of this crisis that we're facing in the church, how can they respond to the crisis and maybe support the way forward?
Oh, I think there's no question that creativity is often our way out. I think if we're going to engage the culture well today, creativity is going to be real central to that. There's no, you mentioned the Genesis story a minute ago, and I find it no surprise that God chose to introduce himself in the first verse of the Bible as a creator. There's many attributes of God, but he chose to introduce himself in the very first verse as a creator, and we are made in his image. So I think that I would love to see pastors and ministry leaders elevate creative people in a really significant way. We learned during the pandemic that, I tell pastors all the time, I love your missions outreach. I love your kids outreach. I love all the other outreaches that you do, but it was your media and communications team that kept the church going during the pandemic. And so we need to understand and appreciate just how valuable they are. And so I would love to see creatives have a bigger voice in church and ministry life, because a lot of this is about perception. I tell pastors that I don't care if you're an anointed pastor, but if people in your community think you're a no-talent hack, nobody's going to show up at your church. And part of helping you have a great positive perception out there is your creative team. How they do social media, how they do the website, how they do video clips and things on YouTube, how they get the word out about what you do. Your message in the pulpit is just the start of the game. It's really all those other platforms. And so, yes, creatives, I think, can play a central role in all this. And I encourage pastors and ministry leaders to make sure a creative person is represented on that senior leadership team in everything that you do.
Oh, I like that. That's really good. Having an executive kind of role within the team as a creative voice is going to open the door for so much to be expressed, for stories to be told. Let's talk about storytellers really quick, because when stories get told, it's so important to, in the storytelling industry, we see the frailty, or let's say the flaws of humanity, is usually central to the conflict of a story. It's so important to tell these stories and include the part about failure. In regards to these stories being told, what are some tips you can give to filmmakers, storytellers, writers, to tell powerful stories that feature human failure, like the ones we've discussed today, and ensure that the world gets a more wholehearted and authentic glimpse of Christ and his church?
Well, I could go for an hour or two on that subject, but I will say a couple quick things, and that is that personal stories are the most powerful thing we can do. I've done a ton of advertising over the years. We've done Super Bowl commercials for American football here. I've done what we call infomercials, which are 30-minute product commercials. And one of the things we discovered during those infomercials is that, a guy could talk about his product all day long. He could talk about it till he's blue in the face. We could show all the features it does. We could show how awesome it is. But it's not until we show how some guy in Cleveland or Atlanta or Dallas ordered that product, got it home, and it changed his life. That's when people watching think, wow, if it worked for that dude, maybe it'll work for me. And that's when they order it. So people don't act until they see how it's played out in somebody's life. So if I was to say one thing to pastors, ministry leaders, and their creative teams, is you find the people in your church or your ministries whose lives have been transformed because of your message and your ministry. Sit down and interview those people. Tell their story. That can be one of the most powerful things you can possibly do. People want to relate to other people. So I think that's absolutely critical. Another thing is your origin story. When you look at collectible comic books, the most valuable ones out there are the origin stories. People want to know about the origin of Batman or Superman or Spider-Man. In the same way, I tell ministry leaders and church leaders, pastors, tell your origin story. How did God connect? How did God find you, or how did you find God? Where was it? What were you doing at the time? How did your ministry begin? People love those stories. So just as a quick thought, a couple quick thoughts, those kind of things can immediately make a big difference in the kind of work you're doing. And they're so easy to do. They're so easy to do. I was on a meeting this morning with a big church here in the States, and I encourage them to have someone who does nothing but keep a record of all the incredible stories that have come out of this church. And we'll go film those. We'll go interview those people, because I can tell you from doing hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of them over the years, that's an incredibly powerful thing to do.
Fantastic. Phil, you've been doing creative leadership for decades. You've been training creative leaders, you've been mentoring, you've been producing your own media for clientele across the world in many nations. With creative leadership, what are some key things the church can do to lead or facilitate artists and creatives more effectively than they are right now?
Yeah, there's a lot of leadership stuff out there. John Maxwell does a lot of leadership stuff. There's so many other people that do amazing leadership teaching, but there's not a lot out there on how to lead creative people. And frankly, they're a little bit different. I always encourage people when it comes to creatives, be a little more flexible. I've worked with people that were amazing from midnight to 6 a.m. They didn't fit into the normal schedule. But let me tell you, they were incredibly talented, and I wanted to really maximize that. So flexibility really does matter. Giving them credit. There have been situations where we've won awards with work we've done, video, media work we've done. And, it's easy when I'm with clients to take the credit for it. But I've realized that, no, I will always defer to my team. And they're the ones that did the work, and they're the ones that were amazing. So I always want to give them credit. And you'll find that if you give your creative team credit, they will walk through a fire for you. I mean, they just love that. It's super, super energizing. I also think, and what maybe another quick tip is, balance stability with challenge. We want to challenge our creative team, but we want to make sure they're in a stable environment. In other words, your creative guy, your designer is not going to design a great logo if he's worried about his job. If you're yelling at him and telling him, look, if this logo isn't amazing, we're going to be out of business. That's just insane pressure right there. And you want them to be amazing at what they do. So, I always tell leaders, make sure that creative team is in a stable environment, that they don't feel threatened. They don't feel like they're going to lose their job if this doesn't work. They don't feel like the ministry is going under. Give them a certain amount of stability, so then you can challenge them with the creative work. And when you can do that, you'll see some amazing results.
It's excellent. Amazing stuff, Phil. So good. So Church on Trial is the latest book from Phil Cooke. It's a timely piece of prophetic and practical literature for leaders who both lead inside the conventional church and for the body of Christ at large, whether it's vocational or parachurch ministries, or if you're in ministry in the marketplace. Phil Cooke, it has been so awesome just to delve deep into this whole subject that's so sensitive, but it's so needed to be discussed. And I really appreciate your time.
Well, it's always fun being with you, and you ask fantastic questions. So I had a great time. Thank you.